Good evening, everybody. My name is Josef Jařab, but I have the pleasure of introducing a much more important Yusef Komunyakaa, a poet, one of the leading poets of the United States of America today. We have been invited to talk about various things that Yusef makes a topic of in his poetry. I understand that those who do not speak English get some interpreting, so we will, to save time, speak in English. From time to time we may even read some translations so that I can boast that I have done something also for this evening. Otherwise it will be more or less an improvised thing because we were brought together and they made us very happy by the organizers. We have been brought together really not for the first time. We met in 1994 at the World Congress of Pen Club in Prague, and the American writers were represented by Arthur Miller, the famous playwright. So everybody was speaking to Arthur Miller and wanted to speak to Arthur Miller. But I have noticed that there is a shy young man there of whom I've heard that he just got the Pulitzer Prize for poetry, whose name, I have to confess, I hear for the first time, heard then for the first time, Yusef Komunyakaa. And not a name that you can forget easily because it's so unusual. You have to really create some space in your memory for such a name. And we met, we discussed poetry. He left behind his neon vernacular, collected poems, and I started to read it. And when I read it, I said, well, this should be translated because we should really get to know this man. So here he is at Colors of Ostrava. This is what I would never have expected. And he's ready to talk about his poetry and the issues that his poetry deals with. What you have heard, the topic is really given. It is music and poetry. And what you are hearing is a singer, Pamela Knowles, who is singing songs that have been written by Yusef Komunyakaa. Yusef, could you tell us a little bit more about the cooperation with this lady?
Well, it's interesting because I think writing song lyrics are entirely different than writing poems. For the simple reason because of the structures. With Pamela, she's a jazz singer, and when I first heard her sing, I thought I could write lyrics because she asked me, said, do you write lyrics? I said, well, I haven't really written lyrics before, but hearing her voice, I thought I could write lyrics for her.
So you wrote for her voice?
I wrote for her voice.
So there is music, however, in lyrics there is music, or music is added to it, but there is music already in lyrics as poetry, isn't there?
Yes, there's music in language. I like to say that language is our first music, and that's why, for some of us, we have chosen to write poetry. And the body is an amplifier. Does that make sense? That the body is an amplifier. That's why we read poetry aloud. We always go back to the oral tradition, even if the poem is written for the page. I think there's something inside the psyche that says this poem is supposed to be read aloud.
Someone said that music is for the soul and the words are for the mind.
Yes.
Do we see so duality really, such a duality here?
I think so, but it's a place where things converge. It all converges.
So maybe to introduce our debate, could you tell us a little bit how did you come to the decision that you want to write poetry, and what made you a poet?
Well, I was attracted to, at the age of 14, I was attracted to the essay by James Baldwin. And I think it had a lot to do with Baldwin's photograph on the front of the book. And I thought I would write essays, but I continued to read poetry. And that's what has really brought me to poetic expression. I tend to believe that the body understands the music of poetry as well as the mind.
I know that you have prepared something to test the bodies of those who are here, whether it really affects them. So why don't you do that?
I don't know how many people actually speak English, but I believe...
This does not so matter really whether they speak English.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. This is a poem entitled Requiem.
Which I'm not going to translate because I have
He's
not
not going to
translated
translate it, but I think you understand it.
All right.
So when the strong unholy high winds whiplash over the soul of marshlands, eaten back to a sigh of salt water, the crescent city was already shook down to her pylons, her floating ribs, her spleen and backbone, left trembling in old world facades and postmodern lethargy, lost to waterlogged memories and quick-claim deeds, exposed for all eyes, damnable gaze, plumb-lined and heart-throb, ballast and water tabor, already the last ghost song of the Choctaw and the Chippewa, long gone, no more than a drunken curse among the oak and sweet gum leaves, a tally of broken treaties and absences, echoing cries of birds over the barrier islands, inherited by the remittance man, Scalawag and King Cotton, and already the sky was falling in on itself, calling like a cloud of seagulls, gone ravenous as the Gulf, reclaiming its ebb and flow chart, while the wind banged on shutters and unhinged doors from their frames and unshingled the low-ridge roofs, while the believers hum, precious Lord, and deep river as the horsehair plastered walls gallop along with the surge. Already folklore began to rise up from the buried ladder gag and sluice, passing beneath the Big Easy, rolling between and through itself, caught in some downward tug and turn, like a world of love affairs, backed up in a stalled inlet, a knelt-down army of cypress, a testament to how men dreamt land out of water, where bedrock was only the heart's bumping grind, its deep dark churn and acceleration blows it down to those unmoored timbers, already nothing but water mumbling as the great eye lingered on a single question, then turned, the gauzy genitalia of Bacchus and Zulu left dangling from magnolias and rain trees already.
Wow. I think this is like listening to music. So, is the rhythm, is it syncopated?
It's syncopation.
Syncopation, yes.
And we, that's how, in a way, we sort of enter music. Especially, I'm particularly thinking of jazz. The tradition of jazz and blues is that syncopation. But also, I think it goes back to gospel music as well. Religious folk music of the Deep South. I'm particularly thinking of our singers such as Paul Robeson.
Yes.
Traveling.
Well, we had a lot of Paul Robeson in this country because he, of course, was the adversary of Mr. McCarthy. So he was considered to be here someone who is on our side, that means on the official side. You know, Paul Robeson was singing spirituals, or beautifully singing also "Old the River," you know. So, but he was
and Joe Hill.
Joe Hill, but also the international.
Right.
In various languages, German, Russian, and Chinese, probably. Yeah, not Chinese here yet. All right. Yes, Paul Robeson was one of the great cultural figures of the 50s and 60s, of course. Here in the States, he was on the blacklist.
Right, right.
Yes. Black on the blacklist.
We can. That's innuendo for you.
Yes. All right.
In politics.
Yusef just tells me that there is a very interesting exhibition on Paul Robeson. So, do people go back in New Jersey somewhere, right? Is that right?
At the moment, yes.
At the moment.
I'm hoping that it travels, actually.
Well, may. This is, you know, people usually ask me, African-American literature or culture, you know, how do you teach it? Or what is it? Do you take it as a propaganda for which side? You know, and this is, in fact, the other victimization of this particular culture.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Music. When we think about music, we internalize a place. This is what I believe, that we internalize a place and that place becomes potable. Wherever we travel, in a certain way, we take that place with us, and that's how we look at the world. But also, I think we internalize the music as well. And that music gets intertwined in our telling of poetry, stories, or what have you. There's a certain kind of embedded tonality. And often in teaching, I tell students, students have heard, discover your own voice, when in fact, I think one doesn't have to discover one's voice. The voice is already there.
Mm-hmm. Well, Emerson and then Emmons, and as his, I think, modern continuer, you know, sort of believed that we do not create poetry. Poetry is already there. That means in nature, right? The transcendentalists believed that the poets only take it from there. So,
right.
How do you feel about that?
Well,
are you a transcendentalist in a way?
Well, in a certain sense, if I think about Emerson in that way, nature. I grew up in a small town.
Yeah.
23,000 people. You know, so it was very small. And I was exposed to nature a whole lot. And I think Emerson realized that nature was also a character in his whole emotional architecture. This is what I believe. And the same thing here. Just the process of discovery was very important to me. And I think that's what poetry is about as well. Poetry just embraces mystery. For the poet doesn't have to know everything. It's not really a composite of answers. I think it is really questions. We pose questions to the larger universe, and we are beckoned to. And consequently, since we are beckoned to, then we are called to express our own viewpoints about the world through images. I don't think I would write poetry without images.
And you don't.
Right.
And you don't, because I found your poetry really very appealing, I have to say, because of those images, the images of home, the images of the village, of your parents. As I think I told you already, I wish I could have written a poem like that for my own father. Those poems, they are full of tension, of course, but to me, they are the best examples of the very complicated and yet loving relationship between a son and a father.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's where it started, right?
Right.
The music there was already the radio performance, let's say, of jazz at that time, also listening to that?
Well, the radio became very interesting to me because I think we had a radio about this tall. And I remember that's one of my first memories, actually getting behind the radio, because of the tubes being lit. And I discovered fire. I discovered heat because I remember touching one of the tubes. And if you think about it, it's that reverberation of the speaker, the sound coming at us. And we are beckoned to that sound. And we realize that we also have the sound of the voice. A child realizes this.
Do you follow the whole development of jazz, let's say from the early 20th century up to, let's say, the cool and the more like Marsalis already and so, or do you have any preferable sort of period?
Well, I grew up with the blues, but also country and western music, interesting enough, on the radio. It was a long time before I discovered progressive jazz.
How did it happen? How did it happen that you did discover that?
I discovered progressive jazz being away from Louisiana.
In Australia?
No, it was long before then, before then. Actually, in Phoenix, Arizona, I discovered progressive jazz. I was really drawn to the tonality of the instrument, that the instrument, especially the saxophone, I think in a certain sense equals the human voice, or attempts to equal the human voice.
Dexter Gordon.
An approximation.
Yeah,
yes.
Dexter Gordon is one of those heroes of yours.
Yeah, Dexter is one of those people. But also there are others. I'm particularly thinking of Sonny Rollins.
Bud Powell.
Bud Powell. All those very interesting, provocative voices. I understand that jazz is also here, interesting enough. Jazz,
yes.
Jazz became a certain way a cultural weapon, because jazz was sort of imported. If we think about music, we think about art. Art, for me, is a choice of weapons. Why would I say art is a choice of weapons? Because, essentially, that's what it is, you know, for change.
Well, yes, I'm a little bit sort of weary with this identification of art and weapons,
Right.
Because of Leroy Jones's poetry.
Yes.
Amiri Baraka, you know, poetry where it comes in the judgment to the protagonist of his play, you know, say, if Bessie Smith could have killed a few whites, she would not have to sing. I mean, this is the greatest nonsense, you know.
But I would rather sing.
Yes.
That's what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
That I would rather sing. I would rather use images, because images are interesting. You plant an image, and essentially, the work of the image keeps on going.
Yes.
Even after the person who has received the image is asleep.
As for forms now.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
Well, if you say so, it has to. How comes you have decided to write operas or scripts for operas?
Why did I decide to write a libretto? It wasn't, well,
Or
it was
it
interesting.
the other side?
What happened is that someone came to me and said, do you think that you could write a libretto based on this monograph? It had been a monograph on an individual who had been a slave, and we only know him by the name of Arthur.
Yeah.
And I said, I will attempt to do that. So, in a certain sense, it was a collaboration between the composer and the director. That's how it first started.
That's a Slipknot.
Slipknot.
Yeah.
The second libretto I wrote is Wakanda's Dream. Wakanda's Dream is about Native American experience. Chief Standing Bear appeared in a court of law to basically prove that he was indeed a human being. And this is in 1876. This is amazing because this is after the Civil War. And here is this Native American in a court to prove that he is indeed a human being. I thought, okay, I would not take it on unless there was an agreement with Native Americans. So that became an enterprise based on collaboration as well.
I was surprised to hear in one of the interviews, sort of your reaction to rap or bebop, and so bebop to
not bebop.
No, not bebop. No, no. What is it?
Basically,
rap music. Yes.
Right. I know exactly what you're getting at. My coming down on rap. The reason for my argument with rap is that I believe that anger is the last thing an individual owns, and it should never become commodity. And that's the same thing about art. I don't really see art as commodity. I see it as a needful experience that comes out of a different place.
So the experience is too painful to sort of sell it, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And that's happening.
Yes.
Interesting. I know that Skip Gates, Henry Louis Gates, also had a very, very, I think, questioning view of that in the beginning, but then he accepted it for some time because he,
yes.
For probably, like in his case, for political reasons, let's say.
Well, I don't necessarily believe that every element of rap is problematic, because the evolution of rap, if we really went back in time, it's already there.
Yeah.
It's already there within the context of folklore. It's already there in the songs, the early songs and what have you.
Of course, I meant hip-hop, not hip-hop, yes.
Right, of course.
Now, you mentioned a story from the 18th century that became, in fact, the core for, let's say, the opera and so. And we mentioned today, when we sort of chatted, the great appearance of the 18th century sort of poetry and the miracle, and that means Phyllis.
Oh, Phyllis Wheatley.
Wheatley. Does it mean that she brought something, that little girl, 8-year-old, brought something from Africa to her new home, to her new place? And do we feel it? Because her poems are, in fact, and they were long considered nothing but emulation, imitation of the poetry around. What else could she do? Would there be poetry here too that would take us back to her original home?
I don't think so. However,
is there okay, a larger sort of question, is there anything, let's say, in the poetry of the Harlem Renaissance, then later, in the beginning of the 20th century, that Rachel Lindsay, a white poet, felt, that there is something African?
Right.
Is this something that makes sense?
Lindsay is rather problematic. With Fiddler Sweetly, let's face it, she is imitating Pope, mainly. She is a servant. People forget that. She is a teenager as well. And how is she negotiating this place? Especially when she writes a poem on the imagination. I think on the imagination is not really an escape. Matter of fact, I'm going to quote a couple lines from On Imagination because it's interesting. She says this on Imagination: we on thy pinions can surpass the wind and leave the rolling universe behind. From star to star the mental optics rove, measure the skies and range the rams above. It's interesting because Baraka says that she doesn't get down. And what does he mean by she doesn't get down? I think he misreads her. Let's face it, she is imitating basically like all poets do early on, imitating what he or she receives, especially as a teenager, especially as a servant. And yet she surpasses a lot of her counterparts, if we think about it.
Are you not getting ready to do something on her, something sort of more deeper, like an opera or something, or a piece?
Not necessarily an opera. I think she had her own voice. Her book was published in what, 1773, and I think people can go back and read her. Yeah. She is her own basic container of her own music. It's in her words as such.
And she is a miracle in a way, yes.
Right.
Now, you studied literature, music, all together, both?
My graduate work is actually in creative writing. But in writing, there's no way possible an individual cannot be reading everything. And I'm talking about, it's not just literature. When I was teaching at Princeton, students were surprised to find that one of the texts I often assign was Scientific American. They said, well, why Scientific American? I said, well, it's that place where terror and beauty align. And consequently, it's that place where tension is created. The rituals of insects, the rituals of animals, the universe itself, what we are made of, this dimension of stardust, right? It's all of that. It's that composite that makes us human and make us question the world.
I think a few people said after they read your poetry that you created when you went back into your past, like 14 years before, to write something about your Vietnam War experience. And I think it is the imagery there that caught me, really, and there is no rival in the end, because there was a lot of poetry written, a reaction to the nonsense of the war, or the lack of sense, let's say, to say the least, the pain and so. And what was it that took the 13, 14 years you to go back to this experience? So what was it that caused the delay, sort of, or what was it that caused that you started doing it after some time?
Well, I always thought I would write essays about Vietnam, about my experience in Vietnam, still with Baldwin beckoning to me from a great distance, you know. And finally, I began writing a poem entitled Somewhere in the Phu Bai, because I also like physical labor. I like working with the hands. So I was renovating a house.
Like Gary Snyder.
Right. Not exactly like Gary, but...
No, but he boasts of that.
Right. Well, working with the hands, I'm particularly thinking of working as a teenager in Louisiana. And being back in Louisiana at that particular time, renovating a house, I began to, it was in August in New Orleans with a lot of dust and heat and what have you. And I had at the bottom of the ladder a notebook, and I began writing images coming down from sanding the roof, I should say the ceiling. And I suppose you want me to read a few of those poems. Is that right?
If I may ask.
Okay.
Yes, because the imagery is very strong and it remains, and I may even bother people and bother you with my attempts to translate it into Czech. So I thought of.
You want to start with you and I disappearing?
Let me see. I need glasses because I stepped on my good glasses, so I have the second best today of me. How about like thanks?
Yes, we can start with thanks. Okay. I can imagine.
Yeah, why don't?
Okay, I'm going to read it first. Thanks. Thanks for the tree between me and a sniper's bullet. I don't know what made the grass sway seconds before the Viet Cong raised his soundless rifle. Some voice always followed, telling me which foot to put down first. Thanks for deflecting the ricochet against that anarchy of dust. I was back in San Francisco, wrapped up in a woman's wild colors, causing some dark bird's love call to be shattered by daylight when my hands reached up and pulled a branch away from my face. Thanks for deflecting the ricochet against that anarchy of dust. I was back. Thanks for the vague white flower that pointed to the gleaming metal, reflecting out is to be broken like mist over the grass as we played some deadly game for blind gods. What made me spot the monarch on a single thread tied to a farmer's gate, holding the day together like an unfingered guitar string is beyond me. Maybe the hills were weary and leaned a little in the heat. Again, thanks for the dead hand grenade tossed at my feet. Outside Chulai, I'm still falling through its silence. I don't know why the intrepid sun touched the banat, but I know that something stood among those lost trees and moved only when I moved.
Díky za strom, co vstoupil mezi mne a kulku ostřeloval tě. Nevím, proč se tráva hnula jen vteřinu předtím, než Vietnamec neslyšně vystřelil. Stále mě provázel hlas, který mi šeptal, kterou nohou napřed. Díky za odražení střely do anarchie šera. Byl jsem zase v San Francisku, v pestrobarevném ženském obětí, ale námluvy mé temné lásky roztříštil náhlý návrat dne, když jsem stáhl ruku, odhrnul si větev tváře. Díky za neznámou bílou květinu, která upozornila na lesk kovu, tak jak se láme světlo jako mlha nad loukou, nad níž jsme hráli ničivou hru slepých bohů. Čím to, že jsem si všiml motýla, zmítajícího se na niti, přivázané na venkovské vrátka, což zachránilo den, jak nezahraná struna na kytaře. To nikdy nepochopím. V horku se kopce možná unavili a trochu snížili. a díky také za hluchý ruční granát. Spadl mi k nohám nedaleko. Čulej. Ještě stále padám v jeho tichu. Nevím, proč se směle šance dotklo bajonetu, ale vím, že něco stálo mezi těmi smatenými stromy, hnulo se, jen když se já hnul. There are many very, very nice poems there, but I usually torture my students and ask them to learn by heart, facing it. Yeah. So if you can do that, yeah. Well, let me start now in Czech. Před zdí. Je to ta zeď veteránů, tedy pomník v Washingtonu. Moje černá tvář bledne a ztrácí se v černé žule. Řekl jsem si ne, jen k čertu žádné slzy, jsem z kamene, ale i z masa. Můj zamlžený odraz mě pozoruje, jak dravý pták, profil noci nakloněný k ránu. Hnu se a kámen mi dovolí vystoupit. Změním směr a jsem opět v pomníku vietnamských veteránů, jen na úhlu světa záleží, kde se ocitnu. Procházím tam těch 58 220 men, nejistý, ta nenajdu v své vlastní v kouřovém písmu. Dotknu se jména Andrew Johnson a zahlednu bílý záblesk miny. Jména se zatřpítí a na halence ženy, ale když poodejde, zůstávají ve zdi. Svítivé tahy stětce, červená křídelka ptáka napříč mým pohledem. Nebe, na nebi letadlo, obraz bílého veterána ke mně připlouvá a jeho bledé oči hledí skrze mě. Jsem okno, on ztratil pravou ruku v pomníku. Z černého zrcadla se snaží žena vymazávat jména, ale vlastně ne, jen češe chlapečkovi vlasy.
Facing it. My black face fades, hardened inside the black granite. I said I wouldn't, damn it, no tears. I'm stoned, I'm flesh. My clouded reflection eyes me like a bird of prey. The profile of night slanted against morning. I turn this way. The stone lets me go. I turn that way. I'm inside the Vietnam Veterans Memorial again, depending on the light to make a difference. I go down to 58,022 names, half expecting to find my own, and letters like smoke. I touch the name, Andrew Johnson. I see the booby trap's white flash, name shimmer on a woman's blouse, but when she walks away, the name's still on the wall. Breaststrokes flash, a red bird's wings cutting across my stare, the sky, a plane in the sky, a white vet's image floats closer to me, then his eyes look through mine. I'm a wonder, he's lost his right arm inside the stone. In the black mirror, a woman's trying to erase names. No, she's brushing a boy's hair.
This is really a story, and I ask my students, what helped you learn it by heart? And they say the images, you know, and the sort of strain of images. I mean, the black wall, and then the reflections, and so you're right, you did well. So the Vietnam poems, could we call them Vietnam blues?
There is a kind of blues, I suppose, at the center of things.
Yeah.
I suppose it's a blues in the needful telling. And also, I think it had a lot to do with the fact that it took me 14 years to write about that experience. I didn't think I would write about it in the context of poetry, because at that particular time, I was writing poems that had been influenced by surrealism, outside of my experience. And still, I had to approach it with images in mind. and there's music in the context of the telling.
Images, images, and experience, yes. I mean, To Do Street is another one, very, very powerful. And I think most of them are there from this little book that you did on the Vietnam experience, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, the influence of music, and let's say African American music or jazz, that I would call American sort of music, of course, with a very strong African American presence there, but call American music. Blues is even more African American sort of, because jazz is already a development, let's say, at least as I feel it is. And we had a book in the mid-60s published here, an anthology by two writers who were aficionados of jazz, Josef Komunyakaa and Lubomir Doruška, Jazzová inspirace, the inspiration by jazz. And there were poems written by American writers, most of them black, but also Carl Sandburg, for instance, and some other, yes, and also Czech writers.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and that was a very, very nice little anthology. I still use it, you know, and browse through it. And I mention it because I know that you, with your friend and colleague Sasha Weinstein, yes, you put together a big, much bigger sort of anthology of poetry, the jazz poetry anthology. Could you speak a little bit about the creation of that book and what was behind it and what did you think you achieved, or wanted to achieve?
Well, it's interesting about music. Music definitely crosses borders. But and some of these borders are just artificial borders, but also natural borders. I thought that there were just a few poems influenced by jazz. And this was actually the early 80s. But once I started researching, I realized that there were a lot of jazz-related poems for the simple reason because the music had crossed so many borders, psychological borders as well. Sasha was a graduate student of mine at Indiana University, and he had written his thesis, his undergraduate thesis, on jazz and Langston Hughes, as well as Michael Harper. And I was talking to him, I said, well, I've had this idea for some time, and I put it aside. And that's when we came back to the anthology, the spirit of the anthology as a duo. I think we have to admit that the State Department in the 1950s used jazz as a political
1952 for the first time. Yeah. However,
yes.
as a commodity of the United States of America, Duke Ellington, right, in 1952.
Right. Yes, yes.
So late.
Yes. But I think the music was more than that.
And was there earlier, of course, in the beginning of the 20th century. We had it already in Prague, Vienna, Paris, and other places.
And also jazz was banned. It's also interesting if you go back to, I think it was the exhibit called The Art of the Decadent that was curated in 1938 by the Nazi regime. Of course, certain visual artists were in that collection, but also jazz was right there.
Well, and the reasons that Goebbels gave why jazz is not to be played in Germany were repeated then in the 50s by the communist regime here,
right,
as
that's right.
Josef Komunyakaa sort of let us know.
Yes.
Right?
So jazz has been political, but not just out, it's been political in the United States as well. We can just think about the various radio stations, what music is actually played. And one reason is that with improvisation, one has to know the spirit, the center of the piece, and one is given the freedom to venture outside of the constructed melody.
The freedom, the improvisation is possible.
Freedom of improvisation.
Yes. Yeah.
But the improvisation only comes about because the individual knows his or her instrument so well that they can get up and improvise and then come back to the melody. Initially, there were cutting contests where you would get 5 or 6 people on the stage and they would cut each other. What do I mean by cut each other? It would tax the dexterity of each individual, the musical dexterity of each individual.
Yeah. Well, you're right. I mean, the history of jazz behind the Iron Curtain and, you know, in Central Europe for, in fact, through the 20th century is a very dramatic history.
Yes, yes.
And it is political, or the adversaries made it more political than it in fact is, you know, because it is basically, it's the cultural sort of product and cultural expression. We have here a sensitive American who just comes at a time when we watch on TV something happening in America, and I do not want to speak about presidential elections because I have no right to do that. But
I don't think I want to speak about them either.
No, I understand you don't want to. But do you have a reaction and a view of, let's say, those very tragic episodes happening in Ferguson, Dallas, Washington, and other places, sort of? Is it something that we should react to, and how?
Of course, I think it's something that we should react to. I think it's natural to react to it because, let's face it, underneath all of those actions, I think, is a kind of fear. It's a fear of each other. I also believe that with racism can be classified as a mental illness because what it does is that it changes the whole temper, the whole text of inner discussion within the context of the individual.
But in institutional terms, I mean, people ask, so has nothing changed really in the United States of America since, let's say, the 60s? And I think it did. I mean, a lot changed, but institutionally, sort of, you know. But as for feelings of the individuals, and so this cannot be reached by law or by a decision and a new rule and so.
I think a lot has changed, especially within my lifetime.
Yeah.
At one time, I thought about writing a book that would be a reframe within my lifetime. And then I would list all the changes that I know and feel and believe. As a method into a larger dialogue. Consequently, we are responsible for our dreams. We are responsible for the things we think, even before those things are acted upon, even before they become instruments of action, our thoughts. This is what I believe. I think the other thing is that we should be talking to each other. We should be talking with each other. And I think we have relied too heavily on technology to bridge the gap. And consequently, in a certain sense, the 1984 that we have in literature is actually, we are the big brother. We have become the big brother as a collective, because essentially Orwell would never have dreamt of what has become 2016
reality. You said that you have written something that relates to Ferguson, and so do you have it ready? Would you read that? I mean, to cup it up with this.
Okay.
I don't know whether. I don't have it. I don't have it.
Actually, what you're talking about is actually a poem that I have here. You want to keep talking?
I will keep that for you, yes. And we will listen to the poem as the last reading, and there will be a few minutes left if there are any questions, so you are invited to join our discussion. Yeah.
Guzzle after Ferguson. Somebody go and ask Biggie to orate what's going down in the streets. No, an attitude is not a suicide note written on walls around the streets. Twitter stays lockstep in the frontal lobe as we hope for a bypass beyond the streets, but only each day bears witness in the echo chamber of the streets. Grandmaster flashes thunderclap, says he's not the grand jury in the streets, says he doesn't care if you're big or small. Fear can kill a man on the streets. Take back the night, take killjoys, cameras, and microphones to the streets. If you hold in the hand, lightning strikes, juice would light you up, miles from the streets, where an electric chair surge dims all the county lights beyond the streets. Who will go out there and speak laws of motion and relativity in the streets? Yusef, this morning proves a crow, the only truth serum in the street.
Thank you very much. And we should have a mic there.
Thank you.
Traveling if people want to use it and ask a question. I see a hand there, so maybe you can have.
Thank you for your interesting presentation, talk.
Thank you.
First, I want to be a bit personal. Actually, I'm seeing you for the third time because first I saw you in Berkeley in 2000 during lunch poetry reading.
Oh, is that right?
And for the second time in Prague. And I've read your book, The Magic City, and in which you have poems from your childhood, from Louisiana, from your town, Bogalusa, is it?
Bogalusa,
yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I'm just wondering whether you revisit your town and whether it has changed since your childhood. And
yes.
If it had also some musical flavor, or still has.
That's a great question, because I said I grew up in a town, it was 23,000. The town has gotten smaller. One reason is because young people are attracted to different locations on the map. And there's a lot more freedom in travel and what have you, but also industry has moved away. I think the music that I brought to the emotional map came directly from Louisiana. And it had a lot to do with listening to the people around me. As I said, we internalize the terrain, but we also internalize a music. The music that we're not really fully conscious of, but especially when we start writing poetry, it is there in the center of things. It is there within the needful telling, this dialogue with ourselves. So I go back sometimes. I grew up being told that Bogalusa was a good place to be from, a long ways from. Oh. But I don't necessarily believe that, because also it taught me a great deal.
All right. What about that music that that little boy heard?
Yes.
That it's being referred in the Venice's...
Well, the music that little boy heard, actually, I keep thinking about this image because it's one of my first memories. I think I must have been three years old, and I saw a teenage boy playing, a blind boy, playing a guitar and singing, and that image never left me, because he was probably about 14, he was blind, he was singing, and the music is still in my head in a certain sense. But it taught me something about listening, because I remember listening very closely.
Yes, and we can appreciate the results.
Thank you.
Okay, one more question, I think, before our time is up.
Hi. I want to bring it back to talking about music. You were saying earlier that you have an issue with rap because of the anger. Did I understand that correctly? The anger that's behind a lot of the lyrics in the music. Is that right?
Well, it wasn't necessarily the anger. It was the anger used as commodity.
Right. I was wondering if you see a position where music such as rap or hip-hop could incorporate the cadence and the beauty and the positivity that can exist in poetry. Because when I hear you read your poetry, and I heard it earlier, I heard saxophone happening, but I also heard the cadence of rap and hip-hop, which is, of course, going to be in poetry because of the rhythm, because of the meter. Is there room for that, for this merging of the art forms to come together? Do you foresee that there's room for that?
We are definitely guided by the images. I think there's room for it, yes. I think, as far as I'm concerned, negotiation is always there. But one has to think about the spirit of it. When you hear rap, essentially, in my own voice, is what I heard in earlier voices. So what we're saying basically is that the music in language is natural, especially if we are conscious that we are dealing with the music of experience and observation. So yes.
All right, so if there is one, we could have the last question, because our time is up, and the program and the festival goes on, I believe. So if not, thank you very much. Thank you, Yusef.
I would like to say that it's an honor to be here. Thank you all for being here.
We hope that you will fill your imagination with images that will last like music. I think it was Vonnegut who said something very nice about music. He said, if there is one reason why I would not doubt the existence of God, it's music. Well, so, and it's very unexpected from a writer like Vonnegut, but here it comes, yes. Enjoy your life and enjoy the music of life. Good night.